Okay, so how could this constraint induction thing work? Well, in like a specific case, let's come back again to our anteriority before high front vowels case study that we spent so much time on in this class. And here I've drawn, a talking head that's like all the adults in the environment, or maybe other kids, or whoever is talking in the environment. And here's a little tiny baby head with a giant ear, so the baby's listening. And what is the baby hearing? Well, maybe they're hearing, all sorts of sa and sha sequences, right, including she. And then they're hearing maybe these C sequences where that sa sound is like slightly palatalized or slightly posterior or something like that. Or maybe the infant is inferring using their own vocal tract that the tongue position for a sa and an e are not consistent with one another, or whatever. It's hard to produce a clear sa when it's next to a high front vowel, but from this input at some point, the infant's going to learn that this is a problematic sequence, and the infant's going to infer the constraint star C based on phonetic grounding, based on either vocal tract considerations or auditory considerations or some mix of the two. They're going to discover this constraint. Now, once the infant has this constraint, we saw already this is going to predict that you could lack this particular fricative vowel sequence in a language. Right? So having she, for instance, wouldn't imply that you necessarily allow this. But no such problem arises with she sequences, right? This doesn't sound weird or feel weird at all to produce. The tongue positions for this consonant and this vowel are perfectly consistent with one another. It's easy to produce a clear sh before an e vowel, so there's no constraint induced here, right? The phonetic considerations don't favor learning this as a constraint or inducing it as a constraint. And so what do we end up with here? We're going to end up with this as a constraint, but not the version of this with a posterior fricative. That just isn't a constraint. And so the claim here is that the child is going to be getting this from inherent phonetic considerations. I've sort of drawn it here as if it's the adult exposure that's giving them this constraint. But the idea in this approach is that this is not actually about linguistic input. It's about the infant understanding their own vocal tract and their own hearing. Right? So this wouldn't be inferred from the adult input. Now let's imagine that the infant actually hears this non-existing language, right? That allows C but bans she. What are they going to make of this? Well, there's still no reason to infer a star she constraint here. And so the child, presumably under this theory, is still going to only induce the phonetically sensible constraint, and is not going to induce the phonetically nonsensical constraint, star she. Therefore, if they get presented with this language, they've never been presented with a she sequence before, and the claim is that they would not learn the pattern. Right? So either if there were no sh consonants at all in this language, they probably infer, well, sh is impossible, right? But that wouldn't be just before the e vowel. The other possibility is that they would conclude from hearing sh in front of some vowel that here's what the child ends up with in terms of a grammar. Am I still on the board? Still on the screen? I am? Okay. They're going to learn that, in general, faithfulness to anteriority is going to be a higher priority in this language than avoiding this non-anterior fricative. This is what the child's going to get from hearing these kinds of inputs. And at this point, it's sort of instantly determined that she is allowed to surface faithfully, right? This is a sub-part of the grammar that they infer from their primary linguistic input. The second you feed input she into this grammar, it's going to come out faithfully as she. There's no way for a child to acquire a language that allows sh in general but fails to allow it before E, because the prediction is there is no star-she constraint. It's not phonetically sensible, or it can't be induced. Therefore, once you hear a sh, you induce this grammar, and once you've induced this grammar, it will allow she to pass through faithfully. Same thing, obviously, not true for C, because there is a specific phonetically sensible constraint against C sequences. So this is the basic idea of how grammar induction would work, constraint induction would work. The details obviously are tricky and are going to need a little bit more formalization than what I've written here. This has been worked out to some extent in the phonological literature. But this is the basic idea. So both of these approaches we've just gone through, the universal grammar-based approach and the phonetic induction-based approach, well, these are going to be referred to as synchronic approaches to typology or to phonology. Why is that? Well, synchronic and synchrony in linguistics refer to a particular moment in time. Right? So the idea here is that individuals are said to have grammatical knowledge, like these constraints, like these rankings. Individual infants have these as pieces of mental equipment at any particular moment in time, here and now, and that restricts the shape of languages, this synchronic knowledge. So the idea is that people have generalizations or some kind of computational system that enforces patterns actively onto the language around them at this moment in time. Individual people at individual moments have grammatical knowledge that produces grammars, right? Or the surface patterns of language. There is another completely distinct approach to grammar and to phonology, though, which I'll talk about in the next section.